So next is another topic I could give a whole lecture or teach a whole course on, and that's nature and the impact of nature on stress. And so nature has been studied for its impact on health in a number of different contexts, but here we're really focusing on the impact of nature on stress. But really where this interest comes from is some really relatively early studies from like the early 1980s showing that putting a window in a hospital, for example, led people to recover quickly if they were in a bed near a window versus one not near a window. And so there's very strong evidence that nature has an effect physiologically, but we're not totally sure what the mechanisms are for that yet. And so I'm going to present here some evidence on the impact of nature, but really some of the big questions that are remaining in the field is what leads this to occur? What are the features of the environment that lead nature to have a positive effect? And so I'll talk a little bit about those, but also much of that is not yet known and is an area of current avid research. So first, if you want to, you can watch a funny video. I've posted this on our page. This is not allowed in Canada, but in the US we have many advertisements that are pitching certain drugs, and they say talk to your doctor about taking this, talk to your doctor about taking that, and so this is framed off of that, with the prescription this time being nature, that if you're feeling irritable and stressed, something that you could try is nature, and so this is a humorous take on that, but that indeed is something that is true, right? So I want to add the caveat here that I'm not saying that nature is going to cure depression. It's not the same as an antidepressant, but certainly nature can help us to reduce stress and to reduce some negative feelings. And so that's what we'll talk about here. So first I want to talk about one of my favorite studies, and this is really looking not so much directly at stress, but looking at the impact of being in nature on energy, which is something that we are depleted of when we're feeling really stressed. And so this is kind of an indirect way of looking at that. So there's actually 5 studies in this paper. I'm just going to talk about one, but this is one that was run by my dad and colleagues and Netta Weinstein, who I still do work with. But this was done at the University of Rochester, and that's just across the lake from here in Toronto, and the weather there is very, very similar. And so that's important here because what they did in this study was that they had people either walk outside or walk inside for a time. So they brought participants into the lab and they said, we need to go to this other room for the study. Actually, for today, we have to go to this other room, and so I need you to take a walk with me to get there. And they either walked them there using a series of underground tunnels that we have in Rochester because the weather sucks so much, or they walked them there outside, and they made sure that the walk was the exact same distance to control for any physical activity. And they talked to the person the same amount during that walk. And importantly, they walked the person outside during all different kinds of weather, right? So there was snowy weather, rainy weather, they have all kinds of weather there, and that's going to be important as well. And so it's a pretty simple study, right? They're just bringing people in the lab, they're going to have them take these 2 different walks, and then when they get to the destination, they filled out a bunch of surveys about their energy level, about other topics as well, but that's what we're focusing on here. And so what they found in this, so this is study 2 in that paper, but it's the only one that we're talking about today. They had 88 undergraduates, and so after they took this walk, they reported on their vitality, which is the fancy word for the measure they used here, but it's really looking at how much energy do you have available to you to engage in tasks. Are you feeling like you're well equipped to go about your day? Do you have energy, or are you feeling really depleted and de-energized? So, this says it right there. So vitality is having the physical and mental energy available to yourself. It's associated with vigor as well as positive affect and reduced anxiety and stress, right? So they're not directly looking at stress, but vitality is certainly associated with less stress. So they walked underground or walked outside. Again, this is closely matched in terms of the distance and the type of walk that it was. And so what's different is, are you outside or not? And then they rated their vitality again. So they had it at time 1 and they had it at time 2. So they did it before they took this walk at the first location and then at the second location. And they looked at how this changed over time. So what they saw is that at time 1, there was no significant difference in students' vitality. This makes sense. They were just randomly assigned to these 2 conditions. But what we see is after they took this walk, those who walked outside in nature had significantly greater vitality than they had before, and significantly greater than people who were in the walking inside condition. Interestingly, the walking inside condition people actually had a little bit lower vitality afterward. This is not a fully significant effect here. There's a lot of variance in that. But my hypothesis about why that was is that even though they did walk a bit, which should give them a little physical activity, might make them feel a little reinvigorated, those tunnels are actually pretty creepy there, and so that might have reduced their vitality a little bit. But I think what's the most important finding to see here is just that relative to where they started, just taking that short walk outside, even if the weather was crap, people felt significantly better in terms of their vitality afterward. So take that walk outside. Yes, this is the greater vitality after walking outside, and walking inside decreased vitality, but this is not a significant difference. Even though it looks the same size on this graph, the reason it's not significant has to do with the statistics underlying the fact that there's just a lot more variation in there. So some people might have shown a significantly decreased effect, some people might not have, whereas the effect is much more consistent across the participants here, where people increased significantly. And so again, that didn't directly look at stress, but that's I wanted to show that one because it's very similar to a lot of other paradigms of studies that have been done. Other studies that have been done have had people sit in a room with plants or no plants, and people are less stressed with the plants around, are willing to donate more to pro-social causes, have higher positive affect than when they're not around plants. You can see similar effects if you just show people images of nature versus cityscapes. But what's important, and this is relevant to the 7 criteria that we learned about in our first lecture for knowing that something has a real effect, is that there does seem to be a dose-dependent response with nature, right? So certainly being in a room with plants, walking on a short walk outside, those seem to benefit people, but the effect size is much smaller than spending a long time in nature or being very immersed in nature. Right? So there's a dose-dependent effect that the more nature there is, the more immersive it is, the stronger that effect is. So being around a houseplant is better than just seeing a picture of a houseplant. But being outside in a forest is going to be even better than that. And the longer time you spend there, the more potent that effect is going to be. And so we really can see the dose-dependent response here. And so we can see this particularly in this one study. This is kind of a cool one that was done in Amsterdam. And I don't know if you've heard of allotment gardening before, but this is something that's becoming increasingly common in North America, but is fairly common in Europe, where because people don't have yards and their own gardens, there are community gardens, and you can have your own allotment or space there. I have a friend who's doing this now in Philadelphia, and you can grow your vegetables or flowers there. And so you go from your house to there, and you and people can rent these plots and have their own garden. And so what they looked at was 30 people who were all allotment gardeners in Amsterdam, so 30 people who had one of these gardens. And then they had them all do a stress task. It's not important what the details of this are, but they basically make you do this difficult task. You don't know if you're getting it right or wrong, and they tell you that you're getting it wrong all the time, and they yell at you a lot and say, wrong, start over, wrong, and it's very stressful. And then what they had them do after that is they randomly assigned them to either read in the garden or to garden for 30 minutes, actively actually plant things, weed, put their hands in the dirt, touch those plants. And then what they did was they assessed their salivary cortisol, so they had them spit in a tube and assess their cortisol at 4 different time points throughout this. So before they engaged in the stress task, just after they engaged in the stress task, while they were either gardening or reading, and then after they had finished that. And they looked at how that changed over time. Right? And so this time everybody's in nature. They're reading in nature, but we're really comparing, is actively interacting with the nature more potent here in terms of reducing stress. And indeed, that's what we find. And so this is what we're looking at here. Right? So at the baseline, when they just measure people before anything starts, there's no difference in levels of cortisol. That makes sense. They're randomly assigned, and cortisol levels are fairly low. Then they stress everybody out, and they assess their cortisol right afterward. And again, when you spit in the tube, it's actually assessing your cortisol about 20 minutes previously, because it takes a little bit of time it's actually assessing your stress 20 minutes previously, because it takes a little bit of time for the cortisol to be released in your system. So this post-stress measurement is really their stress during the task, right? So everybody was stressed out during that task. again, that makes sense. But what's really interesting then is they put people in the gardening condition, their stress drops off a lot faster than those in the reading condition. Certainly they became less stressed over time in terms of cortisol measurements, but this drop was much steeper for people in the gardening condition. So mid-activity and after gardening, they had significantly lower cortisol levels than those in the reading condition. So that's really, really cool to see. So again, there's lots of studies on nature, and they're still trying to figure out exactly what the effects are, but it really does seem to allow the body to recover more quickly to physiological stress. And the reasons for that are still not fully understood, but there's a lot of evolutionary hypotheses for that, that when we're in natural environments, particularly safe natural environments, we can sort of let some of our senses relax a little bit. We're usually in a very overstimulating world, and nature is less stimulating, and so that could be part of the stress reduction. There also could be some ways that we're not aware of yet of how nature gets under the skin to reduce stress. Right? We don't fully know how that's impacting us. People have looked at air quality from plants that doesn't seem to fully explain any effects, but certainly there's something about being in nature that reduces physiological stress as well as psychological stress, and so this is a very, very active area of research. So we'll pause there, and then we'll pick up next talking about pets.